Hey guys, welcome back. Today the case we're going to be talking about is super recent, and by super recent I mean this person has got sentenced today, August the 21st, 2023. This is the case of Lucy Letby. But really quickly, just before we talk about the case, if you appreciate the content, please do consider subscribing. I know every YouTuber says this and it's probably really annoying, but it genuinely does really help the channel grow. Lucy Letby was born on the 4th of January 1990 in Hereford, England. She was born to loving parents John and Susan Letby. John and Susan were middle-class people. They were well liked by their community and they were well respected. They lived in a semi-detached house down a cul-de-sac in a housing estate. So it was quite an intimate little area. All of the neighbours knew each other. And when John and Susan brought Lucy home, all of the neighbours were completely thrilled for them. One neighbour, who has literally seen Lucy grow from a little baby all the way through to adulthood, said that she was a kind girl and even described her as being a delight. She was an only child, but in general this home was quite a happy home. There was absolutely no signs of any kind of trauma or any kind of abuse from Susan or John. It seemed kind of normal. It just seemed almost vanilla. Lucy would attend primary and secondary school and something else called sixth form, which they have in England, and she did pretty well. She got pretty good grades. There was nothing that stood out. Again, she wasn't a victim of bullying or anything like that. She did pretty well, and she did so well, in fact, that she actually secured a place in university to do nursing, and more specifically neonatal nursing. So that's like the really teeny little babies, the little boys and girls that are sometimes up to 12 weeks premature, and they can weigh as little as a pound, so they're really teeny tiny. At university, her fellow student nurses would describe her as being quiet but also kind-hearted, and she had her own friendship group that others would describe as not being very girly but very studious, and a group of girls that loved to study. So she genuinely seemed like she was showing a passion for her career. Lucy would have been in her early 20s at this point, and she wasn't really any different than any other person in their early 20s. She liked going out. She went to pubs and nightclubs with her friends. She actually really loved salsa dancing, which is what a lot of her friends knew her for. She was well adjusted. There was, again, nothing really remarkable. It was just plain old Lucy. There was nothing, which makes this case even more shocking, I think. As normal functioning humans, we almost want her to have a really traumatic childhood, because then there's some sort of causation for what she's done, but there's none. There's literally nothing, which it makes this all the more terrifying. Being as studious as she was, she eventually graduated from university and she became a nurse. She went to a hospital in Liverpool first, and then she moved from there to Chester Hospital, which isn't actually that far away from Liverpool. It's out of the main city. At this point in Lucy's life, to her family, she was a devoted daughter. To her friends, she was fun. She loved salsa. She went out. She had a laugh. To her fellow colleagues, she was a dedicated and caring nurse. Lucy would go on to keep up this goody two-shoes persona when she was at Chester Hospital by engaging in lots of fundraising and various things like that. For example, she helped to raise funds for the hospital's charity to build a new unit, and it went on to actually raise more than 2 million in March 2013, and a picture of Lucy actually appeared in the local paper. And there was also another time where she appeared in a Chester Hospital newsletter holding up a little baby's garment and talking about the work that she did. So the article was bigging her up and basically saying how great a worker she was. Fast forward a couple of years to 2015, and Lucy still works at the hospital, but now she's done additional courses, which means that she gets to gain access to the neonatal ward and perform duties that she wouldn't have been able to do previously. So now she was kind of like a senior nurse of sorts, so she would help out student nurses that come through, and she would be assigned to babies that were more difficult than babies that were stable. So at this point she had some decent experience under her belt, which is why she was placed in the unit that she was placed in. Before 2015, the neonatal unit at the Chester Hospital was like any other unit in the UK. So on average, each year in the UK, out of 1,000 premature babies, only 2 would die. So it is actually quite a little number. In this neonatal unit in Chester, there was about 30 nurses and doctors who provided really specialist care 24/7, around the clock. They looked after these babies in a way that no one else could because it's so specialised. So in all the years previous to 2015, Chester Hospital was the same statistically. So they had roughly 1 to 3 deaths per year, which fits into the average of 2 per year. Literally hundreds of babies would pass through the neonatal unit in Chester, and only 1 to 3 of those would die each year. So it's in line with the statistic. Until it wasn't. On the 8th of June, a little boy was born 6 weeks premature along with his sister. All of the babies in this case are going to be lettered, so we'll call this little fella Child A. Child A and Child B were twins, a boy and a girl. Child A, although being born premature, was actually in good condition, bless him, and he just needed a bit of help with oxygen, and eventually he was breathing by himself. Because Child A was so little, he also had an IV drip, and in the IV he would have fluid that would go in to provide him adequate amounts of nutrition that he needed. The nurse that day had been looking after him up until 6 p.m, and that is when Lucy Letby came on shift. He was completely stable at the handover, nothing wrong with him, in great condition. Lucy gave Child A his fluids at about 8:10 p.m, and at 8:20 p.m, he started getting blotches all over his little hands and feet. When Letby claimed to notice this, she then called a doctor who came in, and Child A, bless him, started to deteriorate rapidly. Doctors tried their best. They gave him a really tiny amount of adrenaline for his tiny little heart to see if that would help kickstart it, but they were unsuccessful. The doctors noticed these blotches on his skin, and that's important because that pattern starts to feature a lot as more and more babies end up dead. Child A was pronounced dead just a couple hours after Lucy Letby came on shift. What the doctor didn't know at the time was that Lucy had injected air into his IV drip and caused an air embolism. And another common theme, Lucy was the only one there for the collapse of this little guy. She was the only one that's seen it, only one that witnessed it, and before she came on shift he was completely fine. When she was interviewed by police about Child A, she claims that she had said to the doctor they need to check the bag, the fluid bag, because maybe there was something in it that there shouldn't be. But the doctor stated that Lucy never said this and that she's only saying this to cover her own back. There's absolutely no written record of Lucy requesting this or saying this to anyone. Then when Lucy went home off her shift, she did a Facebook search for the parents of this little boy, not just once, but multiple times in the months to come. Child B, who was the twin sister of Child A, was also in the neonatal unit. Another theme that's going to become apparent here is that Lucy liked to target twins and triplets. Don't know why, but it's very clear that she targeted her victims. Child B had a long IV drip again to get fluids. Just like Child A, she had been completely stable, she was doing well, everyone was quite happy, and her parents were hoping that eventually they would get to take her home. Child B wasn't actually Lucy's designated patient. Again, another common theme. If she targets a child, she will make it her business to get to that child and harm them eventually, even if she's not the designated nurse. So this is the case with Child B. So Lucy started a feed through Child B's IV line. Again, she shouldn't be doing that because she's not the designated nurse for that baby. And within 16 minutes of starting this feed, Child B started to deteriorate. Child B's alarm sounded and Lucy called the designated nurse to the incubator. This nurse noticed that the baby's skin again had blotches all over it, and she thought this was very strange. At this point, Child B wasn't breathing and her heart rate was dropping, so they started to resuscitate her. A doctor who came to help with the resuscitation actually found loops of gas in this tiny little girl's bowels, which was indicative of, again, air being injected into the IV line. And those blotches that were on her skin, also indicative of an air embolism. And doctors also ruled out other things, so there was no blood disorder or any other disorder or disease that would cause this type of marking on the baby's skin. In the police interview for Child B, it's actually so ridiculous that she's trying to lie about this. So she's trying to claim that someone else has signed her name on the medical records. So every time a nurse or a doctor starts a feed through the IV drip or administers anything, they always have to sign for it. And since Lucy gave this child fluid 16 minutes before they suddenly deteriorated, she actually signed for that. And then she tried to claim that it wasn't her that signed. It's her signature, but someone must have forged her signature. Like, come on. And once again, directly before the child deteriorated, Lucy was the person that was with the child. And Lucy was the one to find them when they did deteriorate. The doctor's findings of these gas leaks in child B's bowels would also be found in future victims of Lucy. On the 14th of June 2015, child C was designated to a different nurse because child C was really stable. So she was designated to a less experienced nurse, and Lucy was designated to little babies that needed more attention and more specialist care. However, the leading nurse that was on shift would actually go on to say that she needed to remind Lucy that she was designated to two different babies, not child C, and that she needs to, remember the babies that she is designated to, because the lead nurse says it was like she was ignoring those babies. So when the nurse who was assigned to child C went off to the nursing station for a minute, Lucy Letby was left alone with child C, and yep, you guessed it, within moments, child C, who was completely stable, suddenly deteriorated massively, had a big collapse. The designated nurse heard the alarms, ran back, and she seen Lucy standing over child C's cot. Child C passed away of air injected into his tiny little stomach. He was only 800 grams when he was born. Again, she was the only person that was there when child C collapsed, and she took herself onto Facebook afterwards and started searching up the parents, and would do so again multiple times in the months to come. This was the very first thing she did once she got home off her shift, searched up those parents. At this point, a doctor on the ward, his suspicion started to grow because he thought, this is really weird. We've had like 3 deaths in a very short space of time. This is odd. The suspicion started to arise a little bit around now. On the 22nd of June 2015, Lucy would get her hands on child D. Child D, unlike the other babies, was actually born to full term, and she was quite stable when she was born. She was in good condition, but she suddenly became floppy in her dad's arms one day when he went to pick her up. And then it was determined that she actually had an infection. So she was brought to the neonatal unit for them to look after her. She was ventilated and incubated, and she had catheters, she had all sorts of things going on, but she significantly improved. So she was actually doing really, really well. They were helping with the infection to bring it down, and yeah, she was doing great. So of course, Lucy is not child D's designated nurse, but the night that Lucy comes on shift and child D is there, child D has not 1, not 2, but 3 collapses that night. And on each occasion, again, the discoloration on the skin was there. And this is where Lucy takes it up a notch, because she realizes people are onto her now. So she starts to create alibis for herself. So when she finds child D, she claims that she is actually with other babies in a different room. And there's actually notes to verify that, even though other nurses and doctors' notes say that she was in the room and she was helping to resuscitate child D. So she's talking absolute balls, basically. And she's creating these little false alibis for herself because she knew a time might come where she would need them. According to nurses' notes and admin logs, Lucy was there for all 3 of those collapses. So she was getting a bit out of control, even early on. She obviously could not help herself. And this poor little baby, like tiny baby, fighting so hard to survive. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And then on the 3rd time, her poor little body couldn't take it anymore and she passed away. And of course, in old Lucy's fashion, what did she do when she went off home from that shift? She searched up the parents on Facebook again. And one thing that's important to remember with all of these deaths, air embolism, or the other various methods that she started to use to kill the babies, they're not painless. These were hardcore. These are painful ways to die. There's definitely a pretty big element of sadism as well. She liked to inflict pain on the babies. And this is also backed up by other nurses and doctors saying that when the babies had these collapses, they often looked like they were in great distress, and their cries would be so extreme, so shrill. And with some of the babies, the nurses would actually describe the cries as nothing they had ever heard before. After these initial deaths, some of the parents would actually reflect back and think that it was really strange that right afterwards, Lucy would jump almost at the opportunity to wash and dress the deceased baby. And the parent would be in the same room just watching this happen, and they thought that Lucy seemed oddly cheerful in the middle of doing this, which is so fucked up. And then, once the baby was bathed and dressed, she would hand back the baby deceased to the parents. And at the time, these parents thought that their babies had died from natural causes. So it was actually on the 2nd of July, a little bit after this last incident with child D, that an official alarm was raised. And it was raised by Dr. Stephen Breary. He was the head consultant on the neonatal unit. So he's a guy who obviously knows what he's talking about. And he knew something was weird, something was strange, this shouldn't be happening. So on July the 2nd, 2015, he conducted a review of all of these recent deaths. And from his review, he found that at the deaths, the common denominator was Lucy. That she was there for all of them, that it seemed very odd. So he then shared this information with Alison Kelly, the director of nursing and deputy chief executive, and she basically dismissed it and said like, no, it can't be Lucy, it can't be lovely Lucy. I think she literally said those words. And that was the end of it. And then he was basically told to forget about it, and Lucy was kept on the ward. On the 4th of August 2015, child E and F, both twins, were born 7 weeks premature. Child E weighed less than 3 pounds. So this little guy was sick when he was born. He needed quite a lot of help initially, at least. He initially needed oxygen, but then he was weaned off to air, and he needed to have a nasal gastric tube because he had other kind of little bits and bobs that he needed help with. But on a whole, he was doing okay. He was doing good. So this little guy needed milk every 2 hours, a really tiny amount of milk every 2 hours. And mum, being in the labour ward, would often express milk and come to the neonatal unit to give the milk to her son, or to give to the nurses to give to her son. So mum knew that at 9 p.m. he would be due a feed. So she went to the neonatal unit with the milk ready, and as she walked in, she seen Lucy standing over his cot. Mum walked over there and became extremely alarmed because she seen that her child E, had blood coming from his mouth. And she was like, oh my God, like, what the hell is that? And Lucy completely reassured her and actually said to her, trust me, I'm a nurse. And she told the mum, go back to the labour ward, everything's fine. It's just a little bleeding from the nasal tube, because he had a nasal gastric tube at the time going down his throat. So the time is actually important for this one, because mum, then thinking her baby was in good hands, left. But on the way back to the labour ward, she rang her husband. So that call was only a little bit after 9. And this is important because later this will contradict what Lucy wrote in her notes, trying to create a fake alibi. You would think that if a teeny neonatal baby was bleeding from the mouth, as a nurse, you would include that in the notes, right? But Lucy didn't include that in the notes. And she didn't include that in the notes for a reason. Lucy wrote in her notes that mum had actually came at the start of her shift and then back again at 10 p.m, which was complete bollocks. In police interviews, Lucy tried to claim that she had a meeting with Childie's mum and the registrar, who's like a doctor in training, who was on the ward at the time, about the bleeding from the baby's mouth. However, there is no documents anywhere saying that there was bleeding from the baby's mouth. And the registrar actually says he has absolutely no recollection of any meeting whatsoever, and said like this never happened. And the mum also clearly would remember this happening, said that never happened. And she had the phone call to her husband to verify this, because she rang her husband and told her husband what had happened with Letby and the blood coming out of the baby's mouth. Obviously you're going to say that to your partner. It was clear that Lucy didn't want anyone else on the ward to know about the bleeding from the baby's mouth, because any other professional that would have known that was a significant precursor to something horrendous happening to that little baby, and he would have been looked after if they'd caught that in time. But yeah, that was the reason. She didn't want it to be caught in time. This poor little baby would carry on bleeding, and although the blood was quite small in terms of how much he lost, for a neonatal baby it was massive. So he lost more than 25% of his blood, and the doctor actually had said he'd never seen anything like that before. He'd never seen a baby that small lose that much blood. The baby started to rapidly deteriorate, and again there was those patches on his skin, and they tried to resuscitate him, but sadly he passed away. And what do you know? At the time of the collapse, Lucy also happened to be in another place at the same time. So again, this would conflict with other nurses and doctors' notes saying she was there, she was trying to resuscitate the baby with us, but then at the same time she was also co-signing for medication for a baby in a different room. So again, she's creating her alibi. And for whatever reason, she took a particular interest in this family and these babies with her Facebook searches. So she searched them quite a bit. She even searched them on Christmas Day of that year. It's just so bizarre that that's what she was thinking of. And the creepy thing about the searches as well is that when she searched one parent of a baby that she'd murdered, it would be like a chain, and she'd search all of the other ones too, specific to the babies that she'd murdered. On the 5th of August 2015, child F had the misfortune of encountering Lucy Letby. So his twin brother, literally just 24 hours before, had been murdered by her, and now he was her next victim. And he also had a tricky time when he was born. He needed a lot of additional help, and he needed to be put on medication, and he needed to be ventilated and various other bits and bobs. And he also needed a very small amount of insulin because his blood sugar levels were really high. This little guy wasn't able to have milk yet, so the hospital would prepare these special IV bags of fluid that had all of their required nutrition in it. So these were bespoke for each baby. It wasn't just a one fit all. They were very specialized. So he had one of these bags. And in these bespoke bags, it's important to note that insulin is never included in these. That's like a separate thing. So they have to get insulin and either inject it into the baby or put it in an IV line. I think there's probably another way to do it as well. Can't actually remember what it is at the top of my head. But basically, the insulin is never in these bags. It's never combined with this fluid. Again, Lucy Letby was not his designated nurse, but of course she was lingering around. And on the 5th of August, this little fella had a lot of trouble, so he collapsed multiple times. People didn't know what was going on, but his glucose levels were through the roof, and a specific hormone was elevated, which is indicative of an insulin overdose. The only way this could have happened is if someone, that's Lucy Letby, went to the locked fridge, took out insulin, and then injected the insulin into this fluid bag, so the baby actually intravenously was getting all of this insulin. And the other nurses and doctors there did everything they could to save him, and it worked, thankfully. And now this just goes to show how fucked up Lucy Letby actually is. So bearing in mind, she had killed his twin brother, and then she had actually took a photo of child F rolling over in his cot and grabbing his now deceased twin brother's teddy bear. So she took a picture of this, and then she gave it to the mum, and she actually said to the mum, "I got this picture, he rolled over and hugged it. I thought it was so amazing that I had to take a picture for you." So although child F survived, in police interviews Lucy Letby would say she had no recollection of the collapse whatsoever, which I find so hard to believe considering his twin brother is dead, who she'd murdered. And she'd also took this photo of child F rolling over hugging child E's teddy bear, who was dead. How could you not then remember that this baby also had a near brush with death, nearly died himself, and his twin brother had already been murdered by her? How could you forget the collapse of that baby? It's just it's complete bullshit. The police also discovered that the night before child F's collapse, that Lucy Letby had took out a syringe, a lipid syringe, and didn't co-sign for it. So they suspect that that's the syringe that she used to inject the insulin into child F's fluid bag. But luckily, he survived. You can see though how she's now trying to get more cunning to avoid detection. So she's mixing it up a bit. She's moving away from the air, injecting air and causing air embolisms. And now she's throwing in a bit of insulin here and there. And she does some other different things along the way too. So we're still not finished yet. On the 7th of September 2015, we get to the most premature baby of all of the babies, and she only weighed 450 grams. That's so tiny. So this little girl, bless her, had been given, I think it was a 5% chance at survival when she was born because of how premature she was. So she was in a different unit called Arrow Park. And eventually, once her condition approved at Arrow Park, she was then moved to the neonatal unit that Lucy Letby was on. So by the time she went to this unit, to Lucy Letby's unit, she had actually survived for 97 days, which was bloody amazing at that point. On her 100th day alive, and some of the nurses had actually made a banner to celebrate this, Lucy Letby decided to strike. And that is also another common theme, that she tends to strike when it's like a celebration for the baby, like if the baby's going to go home soon, or if they're doing particularly well, if it's the baby's due date of what it should have been before they were born premature. She like picks the dates. They do seem to have meaning as to when she does the attack, as well as who. So the nurses and even the parents had a little celebration to celebrate this 100 days. It was very sweet, and they had a little party, but they were called in the early hours of the following morning because their daughter was deteriorating. She had actually vomited and appeared to be very unwell. This time it seems that Lucy Letby was trying to mix it up a bit, so she injected milk and air into the baby's nasogastric tube. And she did this at around 2 a.m. that morning. She also made 2 more attempts to kill this baby 3 weeks later. This baby miraculously would survive all of these attempts. And remember, she only had a 5% chance of survival even to begin with. And she somehow managed to survive 3 attempts by this absolute sadistic psychopath. But that is not without consequence. So now this little girl is actually 8, but her quality of life is significantly low. She has cerebral palsy, she's a quadriplegic, she's nil by mouth, so she needs to be tube fed all the time, and she requires 24/7 care. And her mother actually says that she only gets about 2 hours sleep every night because of how much she needs caring for. And her parents, of course, are so untrusting of any medical staff or anyone that they don't want anyone even in their house. They can't trust anyone, obviously, after what's happened. On the same day that Lucy attempted to murder child G for the first time, she'd also texted some of her colleagues saying that this baby was extremely premature, and that now she's older and doing more for herself, it can take something small to tip her over the edge, whatever that means. When this mum reflected back on her time with Lucy Letby, she had actually said that one time she had left to get a coffee and Lucy Letby was there with her child G, and when she returned, her baby was freaking out, like screaming. She seemed like she was in loads of pain. Her mum didn't have a clue what was going on, and she said that Lucy just stood over the cot, and I guess it must be torture thinking back on all of these memories afterwards and just what you could have done if you had known. And obviously they would never have known that, because who would have known? But I can just imagine that they must torture themselves with that. It's incomprehensible. I mean, there's no point even trying to articulate. Her dad had also said that he'd noticed a change in his daughter following the same incident. He said that she seemed different and that she had stopped responding to his voice in the same way, which is so sad. And Dad had even asked the doctors if there was a virus going around, because he had actually noticed that child I, who we're coming to next, had also fell unwell in the same period. But little did he know it was actually Lucy Letby. Child I, again, was not Lucy's designated patient, but of course she had to inject herself into that child's vicinity some way or another. Child I was born 10 weeks premature, and she only weighed 2 little pounds. She did not need any specialist care as such. She was stable, her condition was good, she was just tiny, very tiny and very premature. But she died completely unexpectedly, or should I say she was murdered. Designated nurse was called Ashley Hudson, and she actually said that in the hours leading up to Child I's death, that Child I had screamed and cried in a way that she had never heard before. She described it as loud, relentless, almost constant, with no fluctuation in crying. It was clear that Child I was in complete distress and agony. And here again we see that Lucy's notes don't match up with her colleagues' notes. So Ashley, the designated nurse, says that the room was mayhem because Child I was crying so severely. But Lucy's notes for the same time says that when she went into the room, Child I was completely quiet. And Ashley's notes say that when she went into the room, she seen, who do you think? Lucy Letby standing over Child I's cot with her hands in the incubator. Lucy tried to claim that she was trying to settle the baby. when in reality, Lucy had been, throughout that night, attempting not once, not twice, not 3 times, 4 times she injected air into this little baby's stomach. 4 fucking times. So the baby must have been in absolute agony, the poor little thing, and eventually she lost her fight with life and she passed away. So Lucy now, as you can see, again, she's mixing it up. She's not putting air into the IV anymore. It's not an air embolism. Now she's injecting air into the baby's stomach. So that would have just been done with a syringe full of air. It's literally like The Omen. You know that scene where the evil, woman injects air into the mum when she's in hospital? It's like that. Like, what the hell is actually going on? And again, another example of her twisted mind. She actually sent the parents of child I a sympathy card, and she took a picture of this sympathy card and saved it on her phone. Like, who the fuck does that? That's the weirdest thing ever. And of course, she would give this to them on the day of child I's funeral. At this point, there's been so many deaths in this little neonatal ward, and it's weird. It's bizarre. It's not normal. It's alarming. It's shocking. This isn't right. You can imagine all the consultants behind the scenes are like, what the hell is going on? They're hammering away at the senior management, saying that something needs to happen. This is wrong. This isn't right. And they're convinced it's Letby. So they're pointing the finger at Letby. But senior management are pushing back and saying, no, it's not her. Like, she would never do this. She's lovely. Another review, because there's been more deaths, they have to have multiple reviews now, shows again that Lucy was there for all of the deaths. She is the common denominator. Another consultant alerts management, so it's not just Stephen Brewer now, it's also Dr. Ravi. They literally said word for word not to make a fuss. And Lucy Letby remains on the neonatal unit with the most vulnerable human beings in society. So with this review, Lucy seems to cool down on the murders and attempted murders for a little while. Just for a little while. So in February of the next year, so February 2016, Dr. Stephen Brewer, he's not giving up. He's like, something's going on here and I'm going to figure out what the hell it is. And he orders a thematic review, and there are some interesting findings from this. Letby's connection to all of the murders is clear, and Dr. Brewer asks for an urgent meeting with executives. And even though it's urgent, he doesn't actually get this meeting until May. So at this point, there's a potential serial killer on the neonatal unit, and that's what urgency means. They wait like 3 months. So while they're dicking around, waiting months to have meetings that would potentially have saved babies' lives, Lucy Letby is looking for her next victims, and she's found them. And what do you know? It's another set of twins. These little fellas were 2 boys, and they are going to be called Child L and Child M. And you might notice that there's jumps in the letters. That's because these are the children that Lucy was actually convicted and found guilty of murdering or attempted murder. There were other children in the original convictions, but the juries couldn't actually decide whether or not she was guilty beyond reasonable doubt. On the 9th of April 2016, Lucy goes back to one of her old tricks, and she gets some insulin and she injects it into a dextrose bag of Child L, which is a medication that he needed. After he collapsed, blood tests were done, and it found that his insulin levels were at the very top end, so they were extremely high. And remember earlier with the other child, we said his glucose levels were high and a specific hormone related to insulin was low, which is indicative of insulin poisoning. Same thing for this little guy. What's really interesting to note with Child L is that he wasn't on insulin, didn't need insulin. No baby in the ward, in that neonatal unit at that time, needed insulin. That was clear proof someone was murdering the babies. Someone deliberately went and got insulin from a fridge that you need to have a cosign and a key and everything to get into. So obviously snuck into the fridge on the sly, or she took it out while she was getting some other medication in the fridge. And she injected the insulin into his dextrose bag. She tried to murder him, but luckily she failed in this attempt, and the doctors were able to stabilize Child L. And then, to make it even worse, Lucy Letby on the stand started to, or infer to blame her colleague, Belinda Simcox. Lucy actually agreed that, you couldn't really deny the evidence, but she had agreed that the baby must have been poisoned with insulin, that someone must have injected insulin into the baby and done so intentionally, which was a big mess up for her, because then the prosecution lawyer was like, okay, well then it can only be you or the person you're working with, and the other person you're working with, it wasn't linked to any of the other deaths, but you're at every single one of these. She fucked up, thank God. But in her mess up, she obviously tried to bring Belinda down with her, but thankfully that didn't work. I mean, just the absolute gall of that, to try to absolutely ruin someone else's reputation for the acts that you have committed. And then for child M, Lucy obviously thought she'd mix it up a little bit, and this time she went with the heir. Really shortly after his twin brother collapsed, deteriorated, now child M, his twin, is now suddenly collapsing and coming up in blotches. I mean, just even statistically, like, what are the chances that all of these twins and triplets, for some of them, are all just happen to be collapsing around the same time? Child M, literally just hours after child L, his twin brother, had collapsed, also now suffered a collapse. So his heart rate started to dramatically increase and his breathing dropped significantly. And the reason for this? Air. Air was injected into his IV line. He actually was suffering from an air embolism, which is one of the first things she pulled out of the bag when she started her murder spree. So this little fella did survive as well, thankfully, but he has suffered severe brain damage as a result of her attempted murder. And on the same day, so just hours after she had attempted to murder both child L and M, she was messaging her friends about winning a bet on the Grand National, and actually right after the collapse of the babies, she had messaged her dad to place the bet in the Grand National. So, I mean, wow, like, how detached from the current situation do you have to be doing? It just goes to show the callousness, the coldness of it. She didn't care what she was doing. This was just like putting rubbish in a bin to her. So now we get to the 11th of May, and finally this urgent meeting takes place that Dr. Breer has been pushing for. So he meets with the hospital executives, the top dogs basically, to raise concerns about Letby. But he was told that there was no evidence whatsoever against Letby other than sheer coincidence. So his concerns were completely dismissed. And then to add insult to injury, he was actually told to write a written apology to Lucy. He had to write a written apology to Lucy, or, he was basically told he would lose his job. So I feel for him as well in that regard, that would be difficult. I'm sure he's got his own family and a mortgage and things, and he might not be able to just get a new job as easy as that. And he thought he was doing the right thing, and he's been told by senior management, like, no, you're wrong. I mean, I'm sure he beats himself up about it so much that we don't need to do that. So even after all this evidence, the massive correlations of Lucy being there every friggin' time a child goes into collapse or that they're murdered, that they die, this was just dismissed by the executives. They didn't want to hear it, didn't care. They literally would always say, like, oh, it's not Lucy, it can't be Lucy. It's just coincidence. She would never, not Lucy. It wasn't long though before lovely little Lucy was moving on to her next target, which was child N. She got in pretty early with child N. She tried to kill him literally just days after he was born. So this little fella had haemophilia, which means he has a bleeding disorder, so he will bleed really profusely, and you need to go to hospital to get an injection to stop the bleeding. And a similar story would happen with child N. So of course Lucy was the one to find him. He was in his cot, he was molting, his skin was blotchy and changing different colours. And interestingly, earlier on that same day, a doctor had actually said that he had walked past one of the rooms, and this was a different baby, that Lucy was standing in a room where one of the baby's alarms was sounding, and Lucy was doing nothing, and she didn't know that the doctor was watching her. How creepy is that? It is suspected that Lucy really forcefully thrust the nasogastric tube in the throat of this teeny little baby and just caused so much bleeding. She also injected him in the stomach with a syringe full of air. She was not able to murder him, so luckily that little guy survived. And astonishingly, now we're on the 23rd and the 24th of June, Lucy Letby is still working on the neonatal unit, and unfortunately triplets have came into the unit. Within that one day, the 23rd and the 24th of June, she had murdered two of them. Child O on the 23rd and child P on the 24th. Child O had been born a perfect, healthy baby. So this sudden collapse out of nowhere that led to his death was so unnatural Postmortem x-rays of child O showed that again he had a lot of air throughout his body, throughout his organs, which meant that Lucy had injected air into his nasogastric tube. She injected him intravenously with air, and she did so forcefully that she actually damaged his liver. And then the very next day, she targets his triplet brother. And as you can imagine, same thing. He was doing pretty well. No one expected him to just randomly collapse suddenly, but he did. With child P, she decided to again inject air into his stomach during his milk feeding, which happened at 6 p.m. Experts believe that this air actually shattered his little diaphragm. Fortunately, they believe that he would make a full recovery. However, Lucy Letby had other plans. His parents at this point were desperate to get the babies to another hospital because they just had this gut feeling that something was horribly wrong there. And before child P managed to go to the other hospital, Lucy Letby actually said to a colleague, bearing in mind that the doctors believed he would make a full recovery, she said, "He's not leaving here alive, is he?" And then you guessed it, right before the transfer, he collapsed suddenly and deteriorated, had blotchy skin, the whole shebang. The triplets' parents at this point absolutely pleaded that the remaining triplet be immediately transferred to another hospital. And the dad actually said, "If you don't take him, we're going to take him ourselves." So they knew in their heart, they had a gut feeling they needed to get this last baby out of there. The mother actually discharged herself 3 days after giving birth to triplets to ensure the safety of her last baby. It was also clear with Lucy's pattern that she, as the murders went on, was getting more and more forceful or violent even in terms of the deaths. It seemed like she was basically just playing God at this point and thought she'd gotten away with it for this long, she would just keep getting away with it. And I wouldn't really blame her, to be fair. The hospital executives at this point they had her back. Like they didn't want her gone. She was still working on the unit, for God's sake. On the 24th of June 2016, Dr. Stephen Brewer has had enough of this now, because that's another 2 babies that have just miraculously died from unexplained circumstances. And he rings the executive of the hospital and he says Lucy Letby needs to be off the ward right now. And she says, her name is Karen Reese, she says that Lucy Letby is safe to be in the ward, and she says that she will personally take responsibility if there are any more deaths on the ward, and Lucy Letby is to blame. Soon after this phone call between Dr. Stephen Brewer and Karen Reese, the hospital executive, Lucy Letby was actually moved to an admin role, so she was off the neonatal unit, and it was actually dealing with people safeguarding with data, which is like absolutely ridiculous. So she was dealing with sensitive information, and astonishingly, it would be a whole year before the hospital decided to inform the police. Ah, my God. On the 3rd of July 2018, Lucy Letby was finally arrested for the murder of so many of these babies and attempted murder.
Oh, Lucy, is it? Yeah. Hello, my name's Chester, please. Look, it's Stefan, 2 seconds.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, not a problem.
Yeah. I'm going to put you in the back seat over here.
Hold on, man.
Yeah.
Get the seat up.
Okay, just take a seat in there for me, Lucy. I'll move that seat forward a bit shortly.
Yeah, I just had knee surgery. So
Oh, right, okay.
they told me that there had been a lot more deaths and that I'd been linked to somebody that was there for a lot of them.
Did you have any concerns that there was a rise in the mortality rate?
Yes.
Okay, so tell me about that. What concerns did you have?
I think we'd all just noticed as a team in general, the nursing staff, that this was a rise compared to previous years.
So police afterwards raided her house and they found a number of pretty interesting things. And also, like, why would you not throw these away if you were her? Which then leads me to think she must have wanted them as mementos. So she actually had loads of the handover notes from the babies that she had murdered under her bed. She also had post-it notes that she had written herself, and it would say things like, "I did this on purpose, I'm evil." I'll pop it up here on the screen so you can have a look. There's a couple of different notes. One interesting thing I noticed about the note was at first when I read it, I thought, oh, maybe there is some hint of remorse or guilt, maybe. But then the more I thought of it, I actually realized in all of the letters, she only ever speaks about herself. She doesn't say, oh my gosh, these poor babies, I can't believe they've died, like their poor families. There's none of that. It's all, oh no, poor me, what's going to happen to me? I can't believe this is happening to me. And there's nothing about them. There's nothing about them whatsoever. It's all about her being a horrible person and her being this, that, and the other. And then I was like, oh God, it's all about her. And it's always been about her. She wants the control. She wants to interject herself into these people's lives, control their emotions in ways that only a psychopath would want to do. Following the 10-month trial, which is, I think, the longest murder trial in the UK ever, she has been given life in prison and there's no possibility of parole. It is literally entire whole life in jail, which is the best punishment ever that she's never getting out, ever. She's in there for good. She will likely appeal, I'm sure, but I doubt she's going to get very far with that.
This was a cruel, calculated and cynical campaign of child murder involving the smallest and most vulnerable of children, knowing that your actions were causing significant physical suffering and would cause untold mental suffering. You created situations so that collapses or causes of collapses would not be obvious or associated with you. You removed and retained confidential records of events relating to your crimes and checked up on bereaved parents. There was a deep malevolence bordering on sadism in your actions. During the course of this trial, you have coldly denied any responsibility for your wrongdoing and sought to attribute some fault to others. You have no remorse. There are no mitigating factors. In their totality, the offences of murder and attempted murder were of exceptionally high seriousness, and just punishment, according to law, requires a whole life order. Lucy Letby, on each of the 7 offences of murder and the 7 offences of attempted murder, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. Because the seriousness of your offences is exceptionally high, I direct that the early release provisions do not apply. The order of the court, therefore, is a whole life order on each and every offence, and you will spend the rest of your life in prison.
Well, interestingly, even bearing in mind with all this evidence, there's still some people in Lucy's life that think she's innocent. For example, one of her classmates from university said, I just know she could not do anything like that. And one of her colleagues also said she knows she's not capable of doing the things she's accused of. I just think it's an example of the masks that people with personality disorders can wear, and people will often think that they're completely different than what they are actually like. And that's common with a lot of the serial killers. A lot of them have been married and their wives wouldn't have suspected a thing, so that's not really that's not an indication that someone's innocent. It's better to go on the actual hard evidence. And in this case, although a lot of the evidence was circumstantial, there was some things that cannot be denied, like her falsifying notes. The one that stood out for me was the one with the mum who walked in on her when she was trying to give her the expressed milk, and then she told her to leave and the baby had blood coming out of his mouth. And then the mum had the record of calling her husband, and Lucy had lied in the notes and hadn't told any other professional that the baby had blood coming out of their mouth. Stuff like that, you're like, nah, that's only one of them are lying. It's Lucy and the mum, and why would the mother lie about that? I'm not buying that for a second. Well, if you've made it this far, please consider subscribing, because it does take a lot of work to do these. I hope you got something out of the content today, although very depressing, but I hope it was informative. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.